Hi folks, you were Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what appears to be the decline of the West and thus the decline of democracy as a form of government. It's ceasing to act and work on behalf of the people that it supposedly represents. Now, how did this happen? Why have all the Western democracies collapsed in terms of their representation of the voters? Why have they all collapsed at around the same time, give or take? And why has every Western democracy been infiltrated by the globalist cabal, which is imposing uniform globalist policies, conditions, and prescriptions on every Western nation? So how did this come about? How did democracy fail its people, its voters, the people that it supposedly represents? How did it fail them so totally and so comprehensively? The will of the people is now blithely, sneeringly ignored, and globalist direction and policies and so on are implemented without the consent of any of the people and of any voting group in the Western world. So how did this happen, and why, when democracy is touted as being the ultimate expression of and something that has been organically arrived at over many thousands of years as being the best form of government we have, given all the others that have been tried and have failed? And what is the if democracy has failed, as indeed it appears to be currently, why has it failed? And indeed, what alternative forms of government are there that would be better? And similarly, how do we define good government? So there's a whole lot to unpack here, and I guess we'll have to be a little superficial on some of these, but what is good government? Now, depending on who you talk to, for example, if you talk to the transgender placard waving activist, well, what do you think good government is? Well, it's equity, equal outcomes for transgender. That's what it is. If you talk to a Jewish lesbian school teacher, she'll say, well, good government is where Jewish lesbian school teachers are in charge of everything. Oh, okay, right. If you talk to the black activist, they'll say, well, the black people receive gazillions in compensation for. So everyone's got a different view of what good government is. Some believe it's the right to contribute. Some believe it's a mixture of obligations and duties and rights. Some believe it's just how many handouts you can get. Others believe that good government means that no one else is allowed to be better off than I am. Others will say good government is, well, just kill all the white people, or so, and so on and so on. So you're getting, but none of those are particularly good government. So we're really talking form of government here rather than the outcomes it may or may not achieve. Now, whether we look at Polybius, whether we look at Seneca or Cicero or Plato or Aristotle, I mean, there's a whole lot of things in the more modern era, guys like John Locke and even from an economic form of government, Adam Smith and those sort of people, then we can see that there are all sorts of policy prescriptions, ideas, suggestions, and concepts about what represents good government. And government, of course, has evolved over time, and it's responded to circumstances, conditions, technology, the will of the people. And so there's been a lot of development in the public services, for example, and all sorts of things like that are to protect the people, protect property, protect legal rights, independent courts of law, and so on and so on. So democracy didn't appear in a vacuum. It came alongside a lot of obligations that the rulers had to the people. For example, establishing a police force to protect property rights or protect people from being murdered and so on. So when government we think about government, we're thinking of a matrix of things. Again, civic duties, responsibilities, obligations, rights, and the sheer organizational functioning of the government. Again, looking at things like the public service, the even the buildings that the politicians meet in, the rules under which they debate and consider policy and so on. So now democracy, the will of the people, I believe had reached its high point, using Britain as the baseline, given this is where it all kicked off effectively, or certainly in the modern era anyway. Democracy reached its high point somewhere around between 1868 and 1885, somewhere in that's where a majority of the population, only a slight majority by the way, of the adult population, I think it was over 23 at the time, had the right to vote. That was about it. That's where the most people with the most skin in the game and with the most obligations balanced against their rights, of course, the most obligations had the right to vote. Now this was, often it was, well, not often, it was, property-based, income-based, so there were certain parameters there, age restriction. But the thinkers of the day and previously looked at which people are going to, with utmost sobriety, going to consider the issues of the day, of the time, to understand proposed remedies and legislative remedies, and to consider their duties to the civis and their obligations to the civis, along with the rights and the benefits they want to extract from it. So the belief was that that was about the high point there. If you expanded the voter base beyond that, then you would be bringing in people who didn't view their rights and obligations as equal to the benefits they wanted to extract, the handouts, whatever they wanted to extract from it. Similarly, they also believed that the people outside of that voting pool at the time, they wouldn't understand the issues. And similarly, there was a great deal of concern about the mob. If you have vast numbers of people that have no idea, that don't understand, only some of whom would have been sufficiently literate to read complex legislation or complex explanation and these sort of things, that they wouldn't have understood it, they would then be susceptible to demagoguery. Someone to say, well, let's just give everybody free bread and let's just kill the people down, that sort of demagoguery type thing. And so they would be susceptible and succumb to that. So that was the view. Now, it was more or less I couldn't argue with that view. You even saw similar views being expressed in the modern era with successful politicians or statesmen, as you might even call them, like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for example, had somewhat similar, that those adult males married with children of higher IQ and civic obligation would be more likely to make the most sensible choice in terms of their voting. And who can argue with something like that? Now we can argue on the other side, is that fair? I mean, what happens to that illiterate black lesbian over there? Why do they not have to be equal to this? So you can have those sort of discussions going on. The Marxist sort of other end of the telescope type concept of what would be good government, but good in democratic terms, at least. Good government is the quality of the people that are voting for it. And when I say quality, I mean their understand their duty to take on civic obligation. And this is very much an important part, not to mention their ability to understand complex legislation and to be less susceptible, if not immune to demagoguery. For example, if a politician gets up and says, and it's free, free chocolate bars for everybody, and I'll just walk away. But there are people that say, free chocolate bars, hey, that's not such a bad idea. So again, susceptible to demagoguery or not being susceptible or immune to it is equally an important part. And that requires people who look at their civic obligations just as seriously as they do anything else, if not more seriously. So when World War I came along, and there was no one foresaw this couldn't have been predicted in the 1880s, where there was mass mobilization of all the nation's resources to prosecute the war. It was quite reasonable to say, well, gee, these people should have the right to vote. If they've got to lay their lives down for the nation, then they should have the right to vote, and they should, by the way. I absolutely believe in that. But that's where it stepped over the edge, and that's where democracy began its downhill slide. And then immediately following that, or around that time, all women received the vote. And why not? The argument was, well, we're going to work in the factories while the men are away fighting, and it's our sons and our husbands that are getting killed. So why can't we have a say in things? And again, a very good point. Why shouldn't they have a say? So mass mobilization and mass, the massed warfare of the First World War and again the Second World War, the privations of the Great Depression and so on, increased the franchise and increased the reach and spread of public services and government intrusion and control of people's lives. So the machinery was already in motion there. Now, following World War II, and again using Britain as a baseline, you can see the commitment of the politicians, politicians like Clement Attlee and Harold Macmillan and so on, in Britain at the time, and their Anthony Eden, and their list, their focus and their determination to improve the lives of the people. And Harold Macmillan, I've got his memoirs just on my bookshelf. I'm looking over it now, and he was like a conservative prime minister at the time, and he was saying how they had to make sure that there was a lot of competition in the marketplace. He says, as soon as the competition is diluted, the prices rise and their purchasing power declines. He says the only way to keep prices in check is to make sure that there's plenty of competition in the marketplace. This is for goods and services and so on, and his efforts to ensure that competition, his fear that if competition declined or that weaker players in delivering goods and services fell over, then that would allow monopolies, oligopolies, and cartels to take their place. And he said, well, that's inevitable that'll happen. So we have to keep market competition going. And that, who can argue with that? But the reason he was saying that was to improve the lives and improve the standard of living of the British citizens. And that was commendable. You don't see that anymore, that sort of commitment to improving the lives of the citizenry. The politicians today, you just don't see it. Sure, they'll talk about equality for transgender or black lesbians, and they'll be creating race-gender conflict, but they're not addressing any of these issues of standard of living, quality of life, and improving the lives of. That's not even on the agenda. So we've now got the situation where there's universal franchise. I would argue that was the beginning of the first big nail in the coffin. But I would similarly argue that if you're going to, force the populace to make those sort of sacrifices for, the mass mobilization warfare, then they are also entitled to the vote. So, how do you unwind that can of worms? The next thing came dropping the voting age from 23 in some places, or 21 in others, to 18. What brought that on was conscripting people to fight in, say, the Vietnam War, as an example. There was conscription in Australia and also the United States. It was kind of a lottery system, but and there's also exemptions for, if you were at college studying something. And quite a few people went to college, not because they wanted to learn anything, but because they didn't want to go to the war. And there was an explosion in sociology courses so that low IQ flunkies could get into university as a way of avoiding the draft. And so there were various knock-on effects and other adjustments that went on around that. But the voting age was dropped to 18 on the basis if at 18 you're subject to conscription to go and lay your life down for the country, then you should have the right to vote, which you should. You should. I agree with that. Should they have been conscripting 18-year-olds, and should they have had conscription? You can have separate and sundry arguments, but then, so the first nail in the coffin was universal male franchise. This is over the age of 21. The second nail in the coffin of modern government was universal franchise for women. That was a huge nail in the coffin there. And then the third nail in the coffin, I think, was dropping the voting age to 18. Now, at around this time, and if you look at, say, voting patterns it's certainly in the 1800s. And again, I'm using Britain as the baseline here, and even and well into the 1900s. You were having some interesting sort of things where the politicians would vote. There was a loose grouping around the party machinery, but effectively there were politicians were voting often with their conscience, so crossing the floor, as it's called, to vote with the opposite, away from the government, and vote with someone else, or just declining to vote, or abstaining, that sort of thing. That was quite a big thing. So the idea of party solidarity wasn't really the huge thing it later became. For example, every Democrat will vote no to something simply because it was Trump's idea. You didn't see that sort of thing. That's a new phenomenon, and you have to have a lot of low IQ children in politics, and a very tight party machine that controls them to get that outcome. And this is the final nail in the modern coffin. Or I suppose the penultimate final nail really was the institution of party discipline. Now, when the Labor Party came along in England, this is the party of the workers, and they supplanted what was the Liberal Party back at the time, and became the Labor Party, the party of the working people back in the day. I mean, they're not now. They exercised some pretty tight solidarity. They were quite ideological in many ways, rather than pragmatic and responding to, they would apply an ideological lens to a lot of things, and not all things, but a lot of things. And so they would vote their voting was quite disciplined, and continued to be that way for quite some time. The other parties were not so. They would vote on a case-by-case basis, which is how it should be, on proposed legislation and so on. Now, the party machinery, then the response of the other parties was to institute similar party discipline in there. And so the party machinery, as in the party machine, became much more prominent in selecting candidates, placing political candidates in districts or certain areas, of rewarding people that voted as they were told to, punishing people that didn't vote the way they were supposed to. Anyone that was any politician that was voting according to their conscience would be thrown out, or again they would find themselves not getting any of the overseas trips and other bits and pieces and perks that come with being a politician. So the party machinery effectively took control for disciplined along party lines voting. Then the final nail in the coffin was that those party machines could be and were easily, when you've got that much tight control in a small area, anyone looking at it, any outside group saying, well, okay, we need to influence this. Okay, well, all we need to do is go there. All we've got to do is control the party machinery, and we thus control the entire political process. So this is what the globalists successfully did. They infiltrated all the political parties. And, if you look at the IQ of the people in AOC and all, you look at the political parties today, and you've never seen a bigger bunch of lazy, useless fucking morons in your life. But that didn't mean that in the previous days they were all geniuses. They weren't. But they were very committed to improving the lives of the people. They were representatives of the people, and they saw themselves as that. But today they don't. They're representatives of the globalists and the globalist policies and the globalist program and the globalist ideology. And so they've been completely lost to the people. So this is where so let's wind this back. That's where we are today. Now, if we wind that back, we say, well, tight party discipline and control from the central point, the party machinery, something could be so easily infiltrated and so easily taken over by outside influences, the globalists in this case. That's a problem. How can we address that? Then we come back to voting. You see these sort of on the street interview things that when interviewers go to, say, college campuses. Now, remember, these college campuses are supposedly, at least, going to be the best and brightest or in the United States, in this, or anywhere around the West. And they said, well, why don't we just get the rich to pay for everything? Yeah, hey, those fucking rich, yeah, that's right. Stick it up those motherfuckers. Give me free education. And what about free medical care? Too fucking right, free. And now these are the brightest people, supposedly the brightest people in the community, and this is now they may never have had a job. They're young and they're they're not taking the best into university anymore, and maybe the interviewers are selecting the dumbest they can find. I don't know if there's any cherry picking there. There probably is. But it's interesting when you see minority women and black and brown people being asked to, free everything. That's right, free, everywhere. And black people are being murdered by 100 gazillion trillion every second by evil white cops, and you get all these crazy, insane people. And yet, when they for the most part, when a white guy gets a free education, well, free. When you say free, who's actually going to pay for it? Do you mean the taxpayer? And so, even there, you see a stark difference between white people and they're coming to grips with the reality of things and the ideological fantasies of every minority group that's been encouraged to think that way, incidentally, and also being given free pass, an IQ of minus 5 million, and they're still given a pass to university. So there are those sorts of aberrations to consider in the mix as well. But universal franchise has been a huge mistake. I can understand fully why it occurred and how it came about, and the reasons for it coming about were eminently sensible, eminently reasonable, and eminently justified. But now it's come back to bite us, so that should anyone under the age of 23 have the right to vote, I would argue no, unless they're again called up to serve in the army or have a frontline role that requires them to lay their lives down for the community, like a frontline firefighter or something like that. And I think they absolutely should have the right to vote in that case. But it's not many of those people. Now, we also don't, I think, come to grips with with the reality that if that were the case, then the leftists would just deputise everyone in the country as a firefighter, just so you get the right. So you'd need some sort of controls there. But these are the things. So good government is, I would argue, the quality of the people who are voting, because if you've got a sensible, well-educated voting group, or people eligible to vote that also accept civic responsibility and obligation, then you would have a much better informed voter. Now, coming with that, if you look at the activist class, the leftist activist class in the United States, and this would include sort of lesbian school teachers, they could say, Jewish lesbians, they said, well, we're educated, we're over the age of 23, and so, this sort of, but what are their civic obligations? Their civic obligations, as I see it, are very narrow. It's to their own victim group interests. It's not to the civis at large. So how do you then subsequently ensure that people who have the right to vote are voting on behalf of the civis and the nation and so on? So there's also quite a lot of repair work needs to be done there in determining nationalism and the view that we are part of this nation state. We are voting for the representatives for this nation state and for the to represent the interests of all the people, not just the Jewish lesbian school teachers, not just the black trans folks and so on. So if this were the case, then equality before the law and equality of opportunity, all these sort of things taking primacy over equity of outcome could be instituted. But there's a lot of work to be done, because at the moment democracy is being totally hijacked by the globalists, and it's not worth a pinch of shit these days. It's starting to make a comeback in the United States with President Trump, but he's having to overcome opposition in all directions, and so the outcome is by no means certain there. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.